faint voices. One by one, he carried people out of the burning rubble. He kept going back into the smoldering darkness, calling out to anyone who could hear, anyone who was alive. He saved as many as 20 people who had followed his voice. He carried 8 himself. For nearly 36 hours, Isaac kept on saving lives, serving our nation, and protecting our safety in our honor and our hour of need. And today, Isaac continues to do exactly that. Isaac still works at the Pentagon, now as a sergeant. He's on duty right now, and he's joined us here today for the ceremony. And this morning, all of us and all of America thank Isaac for his service. Where is Isaac? Thank you. Thank you, Isaac. Thank you. To Isaac and to every first responder and survivor of the attack you carry on the legacy of the friends you lost, you keep alive the memory of those who perish, and you make America proud. Very, very proud. To the family members with us today, I know that it's with a pained and heavy heart that you come back to this place. But by doing so, by choosing to persevere through the grief, the sorrow, you honor your heroes. You renew our courage, and you strengthen all of us. You really do. You strengthen all of us. Here on the west side of the Pentagon, terrorists tried to break our resolve. It's not going to happen. But where they left a mark, with fire and rubble, Americans defiantly raised the Stars and Stripes, our beautiful flag that for more than 2 centuries has graced our ships, flown in our skies, and led our brave heroes to victory after victory in battle. The flag that binds us all together as Americans, who cherish our values and protect our way of life. The flag that reminds us today of who we are, what we stand for, and why we fight. Woven into that beautiful flag is the story of our resolve. We have overcome every challenge, every single challenge, every one of them. We've triumphed over every evil and remained united as one nation under God. America does not bend. We do not waver, and we will never, ever yield. So here at this memorial, with hearts both sad and determined, we honor every hero who keeps us safe and free, and we pledge to work together, to fight together, and to overcome together every enemy and obstacle that's ever in our path. Our values will endure. Our people will thrive. Our nation will prevail, and the memory of our loved ones will never, ever die. Thank you. May God bless you. May God forever bless the great United States of America. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
The first remarks from President Trump as Commander-in-Chief at the Pentagon Memorial, honoring those who gave their lives on 9/11/2001.
And as he was speaking, you may have heard the bell tolling as we were also taking you live to Shanksville, Pennsylvania. 10:03 Eastern Time, marking the moment that Flight 93 went down there in what most believe was absolutely an act of heroism. The hijackers having taken control of that plane, people on board getting word about what had happened at the Pentagon and in New York, and deciding that they would not let that plane get to its intended target. Vice President Pence there in Shanksville at that hallowed ground where they are remembering the heroes of Flight 93.
184 people, primarily members of the service, but civilians as well, died at the Pentagon. Some eloquent words there, I thought, in particular from the Defense Secretary Mattis, who said, "We never asked for this fight, but we are steadfastly committed to seeing it through." And then he went on and talked about what the terrorists thought they would accomplish by striking at the Pentagon and the World Trade Center. He said, "We are not cotton candy. Mr. President, your military doesn't scare."
And the president then following up in his remarks saying, "When America is united, no force can break us apart." Joining us now, Fox News senior political analyst Brit Hume. And Brit, certainly that is a message that could be used today and much beyond about this country and the moments that do bring us together.
It certainly did bring us together at that time, Shannon. And in fact, I spent much of that day, that fateful day, in this very studio where I'm coming to you from now. And hearing John Scott's voice in my ear as he anchors with you this morning is a similar reminder of what that day was like. John, of course, handled so much of the duty, the anchor duty that day, and what an astonishing moment it was. And it was one of those days, I think you'll both agree, that once what was happening became clear, that this was no accident, that this was an attack. We knew that things were not going to be the same, and they never have been, and they still are not. We've made an amazing recovery as a nation from that. But as General Mattis and the President made clear, the struggle against this scourge still goes on. And we think about it every day, and it affects our lives, our budgets, our defense posture, our diplomacy every single day.
There are seniors in high school, Britt, who don't really remember that day 16 years ago today. And yet, New York is a city of museums. You've got the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You've got the Museum of Modern Art. And one of the most visited museums in this country, or in this city, is the 9/11 Memorial Museum. People flock there to remember and to learn. I think it's absolutely astounding.
Yeah, and it's probably, I think about these commemorations that we have every year of that event, and we're 16 years on now, and we're in the middle of a hugely major news story about the storm that's hit Florida, and now it looks like it's going to hit a lot of other places as well. But I think it's well to turn away from that. To note this day, which, as we've talked about, still affects us so much, and about which it's good to give young people who weren't alive then a chance to learn about it, an opportunity to pause and think about that day, because it was a turning point in the nation's history and whose consequences are still being felt.
Yeah, Britt, did you think on that day, as you watched this unfold across the country, across the eastern seaboard, that we'd be here 16 years later still fighting this war in Afghanistan, still trying to get a handle on this, as so many of these groups have now metastasized? We see what some call lone wolf actors who act simply because they are inspired by these groups and create a lot of damage without ever being formally linked to this terrorist apparatus.
Well, I didn't think it was going to be over soon or quickly, that this foe and the ideology that inspires it would be vanquished in a short period of time. It looked like a much longer struggle. And on that day, of course, Shannon, as I'm sure you all remember, we could not know that further attacks of similar magnitude would not soon follow. And that, of course, we lived in fear of that, every day for weeks thereafter. And it is a striking fact and an accomplishment that no such attack of this magnitude has struck our mainland since then. Now, we've had terrorist attacks, to be sure, and they're terrifying, and they're happening still around the world, but nothing on that scale. And you know perfectly well that it's been attempted. We know that. So it's a tribute to the response that has come from this country that we've been able to ward off a further attack. But you know that enemies are out there plotting and hoping they can pull the same thing off, which they've so far failed to do since 9/11/2001.
It was early in the Bush 43 administration this attack took place. It was he was supposed to be the education president, and he was at an education event when the attacks took place. It certainly shaped his administration, that of his successor, Barack Obama, and now you have President Trump making remarks at the president. Your thoughts on all of that?
Well, I remember thinking at the time, wondering how President Bush would respond to that. And it utterly changed his presidency, utterly. It affected him and his vice president perhaps even more profoundly. And those two men pursued this enemy with extraordinary and intense diligence. And it completely reshaped his presidency. And and I think, in fact, the effectiveness of his response is what led to his reelection in 2004 more than anything else. He was seen as a wartime president who'd done, at least to that point, a pretty good job. Then, of course, was the saga of Iraq and all the controversy that surrounded that and all the misgivings that we have all come to have about whether that was necessary. This was a big turning point. There's no question about that. And, we're still feeling it to this day, as you say.
Britt Hume, it's good to have you on and share your insights with us. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
We continue to honor the victims of 9/11, and yet we still have a crisis unfolding in Florida. Irma becoming a tropical storm as it pushes up the Gulf Coast. The storm leaving millions of Florida residents now without power. Jacksonville officials telling people to get out. All that breaking news as we go live to Bill Hemmer in Orlando. Plus, we'll talk to FEMA Administrator Brock Long about the hardest hit areas and what officials are doing now to get to anyone who needs their help.
Patience. We have a number of residents who are without power. We have a number of residents that have debris down. So it's patience is the key word. We're aware of it. We're coming.
I'm Bill Hemmer. Our coverage continues live in Orlando. We're watching a situation develop in Jacksonville, which is about 120 miles east of us. Local authorities say they are expecting record flooding in downtown Jacksonville. The St. Johns River is going to meet terrible timing here now, with high tide expected around 2 o'clock this afternoon. That storm, a tropical storm now, whipping its bands around the northeastern part of the state. Brock Long is the administrator for FEMA. And sir, good morning to you. Well, you've got your work cut out for you. I've got a lot to cover, but first, tell our audience about Jacksonville and what they're experiencing now, sir.
Well, unfortunately, because of the sheer size of Irma, you're seeing storm surge impacts up both the West Coast and now the East Coast as well. So the event's not over. The life safety message is get out of storm surge areas and into a facility that can withstand the wind up the East Coast from around Jacksonville up to Georgia and South Carolina. So please make sure that you're heeding all local warnings that may be in place for those areas. This is a complex event. We're still working very diligently with our partners in the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, as well as trying to assess damages with Governor Scott down in Florida in regards to Irma, initially making landfall down in the Keys and moving up the West Coast.
Yes, sir. In Miami yesterday, it seemed like a tidal situation. The tide comes in, it brings the water in, and 6 to 10 to 12 hours later, it goes out again. Is that what is expected in Jacksonville or not, can you say?
Yep, so storm surge is basically, it's wind-driven water that comes in, and as soon as the winds subside, typically the water recedes. But storm surge is the main reason why we're always asking people to evacuate. It has the highest potential to kill the most amount of people and cause the most damage. So it's very destructive, and we hope that people will listen to local officials and the warnings that they're putting out.
Yeah, give us an idea for the rest of the state. 3 million without power. I imagine some of that will come on throughout the day here. And you've got quite a challenge ahead of you. As you canvass all 67 counties, where do you start?
So basically, the way this works is that, you know, if if a local government's capacity has been exceeded to handle any response and recovery issues, their next call is either through county to county mutual aid or up to the state. And basically, our job is to backfill the state with response needs. This is going to be a very logistically challenging response, but we've been pre-positioned for multiple days. And the goal is, let's get the roadway system open so that we can push commodities on behalf of our state partners down to the areas that are most heavily impacted. It's a little different because of the Florida Peninsula. This is not Harvey, where water was stagnant and you had a lot of land to operate off of. So it's a coordinated effort with our DoD partners, the Coast Guard, to be able to get as close to the areas most heavily damaged to be able to support them, but it takes time. The power outages, we have nearly almost 6 million people without power. The power is going to be off for days, if not weeks in some areas. And so that's why we've been asking people to prepare and to set their expectations. This one's going to be challenging, but we are pushing forward and going in with our first responders to help them out.
Is there a part of the state that needs the most help? Is there a part of the state where you can say right now it took the hardest hit?
Well, right now I believe Monroe County was pretty devastated from the storm surge, as well as Collier County. But here again, we have not been able to complete impact assessments. And as you can see, there's some inland areas that we haven't been able to get to. The inland winds from Irma that passed up through the central portion of the Florida Peninsula will cause a significant amount of damage inland, not only to houses but the infrastructure. So we are still, you know, trying to do initial impact assessments as the system exits the state.
Yeah. Monroe County is far south Florida. That encompasses all the Florida Keys. That was where the first impact was felt 25 hours and 30 minutes ago as a Category 4 along the Keys. Collier County, you described, that's Naples, and that's where Marco Island is, where the second impact occurred at a Category 3. You mentioned Harvey. Is that an issue for FEMA when it comes to resources and trying to help people in Florida and possibly Georgia and South Carolina and parts north?
No, we're still working very closely with Governor Abbott and MKID, his team in Texas. We've established Recovery Command over the past week, and you know, right now with Harvey, we're obviously trying to concentrate on, you know, helping the state and local governments achieve debris removal. We're trying to also race to figure out temporary housing solutions, and we've been working with the governor to put together a solid plan. The governor also appointed basically a disaster recovery coordinator for the state that we'll be working with, and I've done the same. I've appointed Mike Byrne as the federal disaster recovery coordinator for Texas. So Texas right now is a seamless operation, and we have the management staff and the capability to begin helping, you know, those impacted by Harvey with a bridge to recovery. And we are laser focused on the life-saving response mission of Irma, not only in Florida. You know, later it's going to be Georgia and Alabama. We're looking at South Carolina as well, as this is a big event. But you also have to remember we're still in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands as well.
Wow, that is massive. It was a hurricane for 11 or 12 days, depending on what calendar you pay attention to. We haven't seen a hurricane like that in probably 13, 14, maybe 15 years, going back to 2004. Sir, what has the president told you about the support he will give you and others here in Florida?
Both the president and the vice president have provided tremendous support. I talk to the president daily. The vice president was with us here in the National Response Coordination Center for several hours. And not only that, but I have tremendous support from the president's cabinet as well. Each one of these cabinet members have staff that are, in this fight with us, and their staff are here. This is a team effort. Not only is it a federal partnership, but it's a partnership all the way down through the whole community to the citizens. And to help Florida and the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico and these other states to recover, or even Texas, it's going to require citizens to volunteer, and they can do so by going to invoad.org. Not only volunteer in shelters, but also helping people to fix their homes.
You've got your work cut out for you, sir, and a lot of people here in Florida depending on you. Thank you for your time. Good luck. I know it's a 24/7 operation. You're going to need it, sir. Brock Long, the FEMA administrator there in Washington. Thank you, sir. We will be in contact with you and your staff. You bet. Back to John now and Shannon in New York. John?
Bill, thank you. We are awaiting Vice President Mike Pence at a memorial near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. He will make remarks to remember the 40 passengers and crew on board Flight 93 who gave up their lives on 9/11. We will take you there live when the Vice President begins.
Less likely to be driven.
And as we are remembering the events of 9/11 16 years ago, in just a moment, we will observe the moment of silence for the moment at which the North Tower fell. That was at 10:28 Eastern Time. And as we await that, we will also hear shortly from the Vice President speaking at Shanksville. The memorial there, of course, that from United Flight 93. Shortly, we're going to mark that last moment of silence that happens at Ground Zero. That again, 10:28 for when the North Tower fell. They've been reading names all morning there. They go through all nearly 3,000 names. Family members and friends read and share their remembrances of those who were lost all those years ago. As we await now the Vice President's remarks in Pennsylvania.
Wonderful.
That was the astounding and the, I guess, disheartening moment of that day, as I recall it, Shannon. You know, the firefighters were putting the hoses on their shoulders. They were heading up the stairways, trying to climb up dozens and dozens of floors because they wanted to put that fire out. And everyone expected they would put the fire out in those buildings. I assumed it was going to take days, but we all thought that they would put the fire out. I had done some background research on the Twin Towers prior to that day, and I knew that they had been built to withstand the impact of a Boeing 707, which at the time when they were designed was the biggest plane flying. It never occurred to me, I don't think it ever occurred to many people, that those towers could collapse. The North Tower was the first to come down that day.
And if you visit the 9/11 memorial, which I would wish that every American would have the chance to do that, you can see the foundations, the twisted metal. You can see what those buildings suffered and what actually happened to them that day, with thousands of people trapped inside, those who were working there, and as you said, those who willingly and voluntarily went into those buildings trying to save them that day.
Karl Rove is joining us, the former White House Deputy Chief of Staff to President George W. Bush. Karl, take us back to that day in the White House and your thoughts, your memories.
Well, I remember it was a bright sunny morning in Sarasota, Florida. The president was standing about 10 or 15 feet away, shaking hands with teachers and parents outside of Emma Booker Elementary School, and my phone rang. And it was my assistant, Susan Ralston. It was 8:48 a.m. And she said, a plane has flown into the World Trade Center. We don't know whether it's jet or prop, private or commercial. And I went over and told the president. And he sort of cocked an eyebrow and, get more information. And a couple of minutes later, Condi Rice called with the same sketchy information as we were walking into the elementary school. And we walked down a hallway into what's called the staff hold, where the staff waited for the president. He went into an adjoining room for a reading exercise. I scrambled up a television set, and we watched horrified as the second plane flew into the World Trade Center. And shortly thereafter, Andy Card, the chief of staff, walked into the classroom, and you may remember the famous photograph of him whispering into the president's ear. It's funny, I remembered at the time as Andy approached the door, he seemed to stop, and it seemed like forever. was probably just an instant or two, but I never understood why he stopped until a couple of years ago we happened to be together, and he said that when he got to the door, he realized that he would have to say something to the president about this so the president would have no questions, so that the president would get the import of it immediately. And that's where he walked in and said, Mr. President, a second plane has flown into the World Trade Center. America's at war.
Wow.
A few moments later, the president ccame into the staff hold. He had to make a decision then. Should he finish the reading exercise? He thought it was a minute or two more to go. It was actually closer to 4 or 5 minutes. And he came into the room, and I'll never forget it because I've known him a long time and I can read his moods pretty good. But that day, he was cold as ice and strong as steel, and in a very calm, low voice, he said, "We're at war. Give me the vice president and the director of the FBI." And we jumped on the phones, and the day unrolled. It was an extraordinary moment.
You know, we just marked the moment of silence in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, when the heroes on board United Flight 93 took that plane into the ground. It's widely believed that had it continued on its mission, that the White House was going to be the next target. The White House, possibly the Capitol building. But again, take us through the rest of that day. You boarded Air Force One, and there was so much mystery as to where Air Force One was headed or where the president was.
Yeah. Well, on the way to the airport, normally I would be in a car 2 or 3 vehicles behind the presidential limousine, but that day the president whistled at me and motioned to the back seat of the car, so I rode with him to the airport. And that's where we got the news of the strike on the Pentagon. The phone rang in the car. It was deadly quiet. We were going 85 miles an hour down the freeway, about twice as fast as a motorcade normally moves, and the phone rang. And I could only hear one side of the conversation, but I knew it was bad news when the president said, "Is Rumsfeld alive?"
Wow.
Secretary Rumsfeld was very much alive. He had moved from his office to join the rescue efforts outside the building, but the president was concerned that he was gone. I remember that was so. I just flinched when I heard that and looked to the side, and I realized the car was surrounded by 4 police cars, 2 on either side, blocking, matching our speed, 85 miles an hour. I'd never seen that before in a motorcade. Never saw it again. Later in the day, I asked the head of the detail that day, Eddie, why that was, and he said, "We're afraid that our whereabouts were known. We were afraid a car bomber might try and interdict the presidential limousine, so we wanted the car bomb to go off 10 or 15 feet further away from the vehicle, giving the president a better chance of surviving."
Carl, as you remember the events of that day in 2001, the vice president is in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, making remarks. Let's listen in.
President Trump asked me to be here to pay a debt of honor to the 40 heroes of Flight 93, to all the fallen and their families, and to the generation of heroes they inspired, and to tell you that his heart is here in Pennsylvania, especially with all of you who lost loved ones 16 years ago. Our president observed this day of remembrance at the Pentagon Memorial, where moments ago he paid tribute to the 184 men and women who lost their lives there. All of our hearts as well are with the families of the 2,753 men and women, their families, who lost their lives at the World Trade Center in New York City. As the president said just moments ago, we grieve with every family of the innocent souls who were murdered by terrorists that day. And we will never forget what happened on September 11th, 2001. Today we pause as a nation not so much to remember tragedy as to celebrate heroism and patriotism. But permit me to say that on this day, as Gordy said before, our hearts and our prayers are also with our fellow Americans in Florida and throughout the region who've suffered loss in the winds and waters of Hurricane Irma. At this very hour, first responders and new citizen heroes are being forged among the people of Florida. And And as the President has said, I say again, to those affected by Hurricane Irma, we are with you. We will stay with you, and we will be with you every day after this tempest passes to restore, recover, and rebuild. Everyone remembers where they were on this day 16 years ago. A mom rousing her children to get ready for school. A farmer wrapping up the morning chores. A coal miner finishing the third shift and heading home. As a new member of Congress, I was going through my normal workday routine at the United States Capitol when I learned of the attacks in New York City and at the Pentagon. I will always remember the scenes of that day, watching the Capitol complex being evacuated. It was as though the building was literally hemorrhaging with people running in every direction. I found myself just across the street from the U.S. Capitol eventually, on the top floor of the headquarters of the Capitol Police Chief. I was there with leaders of the House and Senate. Shortly after I arrived, the Chief of Police set the phone back down and informed the leaders gathered there that there was a plane inbound to the Capitol, and he said it was 12 minutes out. In that moment, the room became silent, and as people began to make plans, I found myself looking out the window, where just across the street was the Capitol Dome, with that majestic Statue of Freedom standing atop it. A dome that's a symbol of the ideals of this nation, of freedom and democracy for all the world. So we waited. It was the longest 12 minutes of my life. But it turned to 13 minutes, then 14. And then we were informed that the plane had gone down in a field in Pennsylvania. In the days ahead, like every American, we would learn the story of the 40 heroes of Flight 93, men and women who looked evil squarely in the eye, and without regard to their personal safety, they rushed forward to save lives. They were mothers and fathers, your brothers and sisters, sons and daughters from every walk of life, of every background. Mark Bingham was on his way to be an usher in his college friend's wedding. Cece Lyles was living her childhood dream to be a flight attendant in the wake of a career in law enforcement. Lauren Grancolis carried the spark of life within her, an unborn child 3 months along. And Bill Cashman, himself a former Army paratrooper with the 101st Airborne, had actually helped to build the World Trade Center with his own 2 hands. And there were so many others whose names we just heard echo into the wind this morning. They were ordinary people, but on that day they became extraordinary. We all know the story. Flight 93 took off at 8:42, departing Newark to San Francisco. 46 minutes later, terrorists seized control. At 9:35, the plane diverted toward Washington, D.C. Passengers called their loved ones only to find out what was happening across the country. They learned what the rest of America knew. The World Trade Center had been struck. The Pentagon had been hit only a few moments after they were hijacked. They figured out that the terrorists intended to use their plane for the same purpose. But as Tom Burnett told his wife on the phone, we're going to do something. And they did. The men and women of Flight 93 began to join together. They devised a plan in those short moments. They knew their objective. They not only planned, but history records that they prayed. Together with Lisa Jefferson, a phone operator on the ground below, we're told they prayed the Lord's Prayer and recited those ancient words. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. At 9:57, after only 29 minutes, Todd Beamer spoke those words that America and the world will never forget. Let's roll. They charged the cockpit. They took hold of their fate. And 6 minutes later, at 10:03, Flight 93 plummeted here to the earth. The brave men and women aboard sacrificed their lives for the country we call home. We gather here today because the men and women of Flight 93 are heroes.